Hi, my name is Aidyn Osgood. I'm a visiting assistant professor of gender and women's studies here at Pomona, and I do research and I teach a class on witchcraft in early modern Europe. Today, we're going to be talking about the evolution of witches and witchcraft. This is Office Hours. First question, what is a witch? The definition has changed over time, but there are two important continuities. First, witches perform some sort of illicit magic, as distinct from divinely ordained miracles. That's why Pharaoh's magic workers in Exodus are magicians, but Moses is a prophet, despite the fact that they both turn water to blood and staffs into snakes. Second, witches perform harmful magic, which learned elites in medieval and early modern Europe termed maleficium, literally evil deed. During Europe's most intensive period of witch hunting, between roughly 1550 and 1670, witches were understood to make pacts with demons, destroy crops, and murder babies. More recently, people have started to reclaim the label, as with Glinda in The Wizard of Oz and Wicked, and numerous feminists worldwide who practice rituals inspired partially by activities attributed to witches, like meeting in the woods at night and worshiping non-Christian spiritual forces. In this latter context, a witch is simply anyone who identifies as one. How have witches been portrayed differently in media over time? What are your favorite portrayals of witches in films? In the early medieval period, people approached witchcraft with a mix of fear, fascination, and pity. The 12th century English historian William of Malmesbury described the death of a witch in the town of Berkeley in ways that elicit sympathy. After she died, a demon arrives and drags her still screaming body down to hell as her children watch on. Malmesbury urges his readers to learn from her mistake and to place their faith in God's will, rather than seeking magical solutions to their problems. And this tale of moral instruction circulated widely in the medieval period. Over time, anxiety displaced pity, but fascination remained. In the 16th and 17th centuries, artists depicted witches as lascivious, murderous demon worshippers who wielded immense power. Belief in witchcraft waned in the late 17th and 18th centuries in Europe, and artists and writers routinely shamed people who believed in magical powers as ignorant, deluded, or crazy. From the 19th century onward, witches primarily became literary and artistic motifs, representing a lost, whimsical, magical world. At the same time, Europeans located witchcraft in their various colonial and imperial holdings, racializing witchcraft belief to justify colonization. Today, witches represent women who stand up to patriarchal authority, challenge Eurocentric epistemologies and ontologies, and wield their magic for good or evil. The conflict between Harry Potter and Voldemort is a good example of the growing moral ambivalence of witchy portrayals in the 21st century. My favorite depictions of witches in films draw heavily on historical sources produced during actual witch trials. Robert Eggers' 2015 The Witch, starring Anya Taylor-Joy, is a phenomenal exploration of psychology and witchcraft belief in colonial New England. But Carl Theodor Dreyer's 1943 Day of Wrath, Friedensdate, is my favorite, partially because it draws amply on a trial transcript from 17th century Norway, and partially because it was produced in Nazi-occupied Denmark. The parallels of persecution for imaginary crimes, whether they be attributed to witches or Jews, are really powerful. Next question. What do depictions of witches reveal about societal attitudes towards women and power? Well, women in power threaten patriarchal societies, especially when their power is not perceived as deriving from male authorities. Witches represent the ability of women to claim their power and assert themselves over and against their subordination. At the same time as many mass media depictions relish in female empowerment, they often work to contain it by sexualizing witches or domesticating them by bringing them back into the social fold at the end of a plot. This is an old story. The German artist Hans Baldung felt comfortable enough to send a New Year's greeting depicting 3 lascivious nude witches to a clerical friend in 1514. In short, witches are fascinating and scary insofar as they defy patriarchal mores and wield powerful forces that operate outside or against patriarchal and heteronormative power. I think Wicked explores these themes quite capably. In the play and in the movie, people are fascinated and scared by Elphaba's ability to challenge the Wizard of Oz, but Glinda's collaboration with those in power makes her a good witch. The feminist question is, who really is the good witch in their story? Why do you think witches remain such enduring figures in popular culture? That's a great question. I think it's complicated, but one of the themes that my course explores is that witches represent a world we have lost. When the world increasingly seems shaped by rules, protocols, and laws, think those of economics, physics, computer science, mathematics, and legislation, witches represent the unknowable and the power of those who can tap into ungovernable and incomprehensible forces. Witches are rebellious and feminist exactly because they cannot be explained entirely by reference to these laws. I think the popularity of witches persists partially in their ability to exert power, rebel against authority, and evade the kinds of regimented logic and regulation that increasingly characterizes our world and our systems of knowledge. Why are witches currently trending, and why is the witch economy booming? This is a tough question. There are many ways and many things that make witches fashionable now, and they're so enmeshed in each other that it's hard to isolate any particular reasons. But if I'm shooting from the hip, I think that witches tap into the anxieties and challenge the markets of the world we inhabit today. As figures who challenge patriarchal norms, witches signal women's empowerment and collaborate in feminist and decolonial movements. Witches also represent alternatives to institutionalized forms of knowledge and authority, as people globally have grown increasingly skeptical of institutions, be they governmental, medical, or economic. The witch economy, in which people buy spells, athames, amulets, herbs, crystals, and grimoires from practicing witches, has largely resisted the co-option of multinational corporations and conglomerates like Amazon, Walmart, and Target, at least so far. The witch economy feels more human-centered, environmentally responsible, and bespoke than mass-produced wares whose purchase lines the pockets of the world's billionaires and despoils the earth of its resources. Here, witches surface, and often style themselves, as alternatives to established and hegemonic companies. I think that helps explain why people find purchasing wares from witches so attractive. Last question. What can studying witches teach us about history and society? There are so many directions to take this, but I think the most powerful one for our current moment of partisanship, AI deepfakes, and alternative facts is that studying witches demands that we be rigorous, critical thinkers. Even at the height of the European witch hunts, people doubted the reality of witchcraft. Believers in witchcraft countered skeptics' arguments by pointing to historical and contemporaneous evidence of witchcraft. They argued that if witches existed in the past, and they produced ample evidence from the Bible like the Witch of Endor, the ancient world like Medea, and medieval texts like Malmesbury's Sorceress at Berkeley that showed that they did, and if people confessed that they were witches, sometimes under torture and sometimes not, surely there were witches. But proof can be manufactured. Evidence can be misconstrued. For example, in the final pages of the record of a woman called Tempel Anneke in Brunswick, Germany, who was executed as a witch on December 30th, 1663, we read that she, quote, confessed without torture, unquote, to the crime. But if we read more deeply, we see that her confession came only after brutal torture. In one of her later depositions, she confirmed her confession under the threat of more torture if she recanted her initial confession. So the framing that she confessed without torture, while technically true for a single deposition, is vastly misleading. And this duplicitous framing helped to confirm the reality of witchcraft to many people in 17th century Europe. Studying witches and witchcraft requires us to doubt to contextualize where knowledge comes from, to ascertain the goal of any particular document, to assess what texts represent accurately and what they misrepresent, to question assumptions that undergird claims to truth, to weigh evidence carefully, and to commit to thinking critically, especially when others around us seem to be certain.